Good afternoon, everybody. I have the esteemed pleasure of introducing our guest speaker today. Dr. Jeffrey A. Lieberman is the Lawrence C. Cole Professor and Chairman of Psychiatry at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, Director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and Psychiatrist-in-Chief of New York Presbyterian Hospital at the Columbia University Medical Center. Formerly the President of the American Psychiatric Association, in 2000 he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine. He lives with his wife in New York City, and Rosemary is here today as well. Without further ado, Dr. Lieberman.
Thank you, Such, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Pleasure to be here. My first time visiting the Google campus, and I'm here to give a talk, but it's really to promote my book. And I give a lot of lectures to all types of professional or scientific groups, and periodically to lay audiences as well. But this is really the first time doing sort of a book promotion talk. And in the course of my career, which has been 30 plus years in the field of psychiatry and mostly sort of in academic psychiatry, I've written many articles, hundreds of articles for the scientific literature, and a bunch of books for a professional audience, but never for the general public. And this was the first one that I did. First thing I'd like to say is that the title of it, Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry, is not my idea. When I sort of thought, and I'll tell you sort of what led me to write the book in the first place, when I first decided that I was going to do a book for the general audience and was developing a proposal, agent got a publisher who was very interested in this topic, and I went to see her and I told her about the book and said, well, what are you calling it? And I said, well, I was thinking of something on the lines of, and I wanted to come up with something which was poetic and eloquent. I was thinking along the lines of Pariahs in the Palace of Medicine, or Sojourn in the Scientific Wilderness. And she looks at me and she says, that's not going to work. And I said, well, what do you think? I said, well, just give me a couple of days. So she took the proposal, or what I had of it at the time, and she, I guess, sort of shopped it around in terms of the office, and calls me up and says, I got your title. I said, what is it? She said, it's Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry. I said, Shrinks, I can't use that. She says, why not? I said, well, it's kind of demeaning, isn't it? She says, but that's what everybody thinks about when they think about psychiatry. It's the most common reference. So do you want to write a book for your colleagues, or do you want to write a book that a wider audience is going to read? So hence the title. The cover wasn't my idea either. The couch, I wanted a brain with neural circuits and all these things. So it shows you how knowledge is not necessarily transferable across disciplines. But the reason I wrote the book was that, I never really had any aspirations to write in this way, to become like a TV doc or write for the public. But over the course of my career, 30 plus years, mostly doing research in the neurobiology and psychopharmacology of more severe mental disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, I became kind of increasingly aware and increasingly frustrated by the fact that millions of people suffer from mental illness, experience their symptoms, and don't avail themselves of treatment for the simple reason that either they are not aware of what it is, because it's not like when you have a bellyache or you're short of breath, or you have some kind of dysfunction in your urination or elimination process. They don't know, or they're ashamed, or they don't know how to find competent care. And the analogy would be, imagine if the American population was experiencing various types of infectious diseases, pneumonia, tuberculosis, malaria, polio, AIDS, and many of the people who were sick weren't getting antibiotics, hadn't previously been treated with vaccines, and weren't offered, let's say, protease inhibitors or antiretrovirals, because there was suspicion or ignorance out there. Now, Jenny McCarthy would probably say that's probably a good thing, but I don't think many people would agree with her. But that is the case for mental illness. And so the question is, sort of, why is that the case? And the simple reason is that it's stigma. So to put it very succinctly, mental illnesses, which I'll define for you in a minute, are nothing new. You know, they're not like chronic fatigue syndrome, they're not like Ebola, they're not like AIDS, things that are newly emergent. These are illnesses that have been present since the beginning of recorded history. But they weren't well understood. I mean, historically, it was thought to be related to demon possession or supernatural phenomena or curses of the gods or something like that. And then in the modern era, beginning in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, when medical science sort of began to investigate the pathologic bases of illness, there really wasn't much traction that was able to be achieved with mental disorders. So there was always this sort of mystery around it and lack of understanding based on scientific progress, and there were no treatments to speak of. But all that changed, and it changed very rapidly. And the inflection point was really after World War II in the 1950s. But even today, which is 65 years later, the attitudes and the prejudices and the ignorance associated historically with mental illness and by extension psychiatry continues. So whereas if you had a mental illness and prior to 1950s, there was nothing that could really be effective in treating you. You were either doomed to endure your symptoms, or if they were really bad and incapacitating and you didn't have a family that could support you, you likely would spend some extended period of time, if not your whole life, in a mental institution. And that's because there just wasn't anything available. But now, the biggest barrier to treatment for people is not the lack of know-how and the lack of treatments. The biggest barrier is simply the stigma. And in this way, mental illness and psychiatry are unique. The best way to illustrate that is to explain or to tell you something you probably already know, is that there is a very active, virulent anti-psychiatry movement. I mean, have you ever heard of an anti-cardiology movement? Or an anti-dermatology movement? Or an anti-orthopedics movement? But there's an anti-psychiatry movement. And it actually began in the 1960s. So mental illness and psychiatry has been victimized in this way. To put it in a humorous way, psychiatry is like the Rodney Dangerfield of medicine. It doesn't get any respect. Put it in a more sober way, it's kind of the stepchild of medicine. It's been a late bloomer. And these things, just like a sibling who's the slowest to develop, who's the runt of the litter, is the butt of jokes and maybe not picked first to be on the team and has low expectations associated with it. But in the long run, they end up being either quite as accomplished and capable as the other siblings or even surpass them in some respects. And that's basically the story of psychiatry. Now, you're listening to me tell this, and you say, oh, he's a psychiatrist. He's going to be sort of tooting his own horn, blowing his own horn, and being self-serving. But I have to tell you that I don't think that's the case. And when I speak publicly, there's a lot of hecklers, and there's a lot of people who I'm just doing some talk shows or radio talk shows in San Francisco, and you get a lot of really nasty stuff that comes in. And I doubt if cardiologists or orthopedists or pediatricians would get this. I mean, people might disagree or something, but so there's really strong and feelings and emotions associated with this. So let me just tell you first what I mean by mental illness, because there's a lot of misconceptions. I mean, misconceptions abound. Everybody's mentally ill a little bit. schizophrenia as having a split personality or holding two mutually contradictory opinions at the same time. Mental illness is really kind of freedom of expression and not succumbing to the oppressive conventions of the world. So many misconceptions. What's the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist? There's many misconceptions which basically have to do with a lack of sort of understanding and awareness. So for our purposes, mental illness is distinct from what we'll call problems of living and the worried well, which everyone experiences in the course of their life because life is variable, challenging, and oftentimes tough. But the human organism is built to endure this unless they sustain some injury or illness. And the brain can get ill just like every other organ of the body. So for the purpose, mental illness are really a defined set of conditions that are related ostensibly to dysfunctions of certain parts of the brain that mediate functions relating to cognition, perception, emotion regulation, information storage, and processing, and can be defined in a systematic way and follow a fairly uniform or predictable course. So there's clear boundaries or definitions of what they are, and there are clear boundaries between what's the variation in human behavior and mental states and what is an illness. Now, so we're not talking about the worried well, we're not talking about problems in living, and if you want to make a distinction right off the bat between psychiatrists and the rest of the mental health care providers, be they psychologists, social workers, lay therapists, pastoral counselors, clergymen, New Age practitioners, it's that psychiatrists deal with the so-called illnesses of the brain manifest through the mind and behavior, and the others deal with the aspects that we face in the course of our lives that don't evolve or develop into illnesses. Now, my purpose in writing the book was that it became increasingly apparent that many people weren't being treated who should be. And there was no good reason from that other than stigma and prejudice. So I wanted to try and put this out there and sort of set the record straight about this. And it seemed that I was in a good position to be able to do it because I had had some success in terms of my academic career as a researcher. I had gained some prominence in terms of the profession by becoming president of the American Psychiatric Association, and I had had 30 years of experience, clinical experience on the ground, and by virtue of my research, I was sort of at a position that I could understand exactly what was happening at the cutting edge of progress and knowing where things were going to go. So I felt that I was in a position to not just offer an opinion, but to really synthesize these different streams of information. And then there was also another factor that I thought made me really well suited to this kind of task, which was that just by dint of when my parents met and decided to, procreate, I was born at a time that landed me in medical school at the time that psychiatry was going through this inflection point. So remember I told you that in medicine in the 18th century, there were not specialties like we have now. Now we have like 40 different subspecialties of medicine. 18th century, there were physicians and surgeons, there were midwives, there were bone doctors. Neurology and psychiatry differentiated as brain doctors in the beginning of the 19th century. When the other fields, by virtue of sort of progress and research, began to progress and psychiatry didn't, after World War II in the 50s, this was the time when really things began to move forward scientifically speaking, and that was largely because of the introduction of psychotropic drugs, which came about through pure serendipity as opposed to like hypothesis-driven research. But in any event, this process, which began in the 50s, introducing for the first time in history treatments that actually worked, form of medications that could alleviate severe illnesses, not cure them, but alleviate the symptoms, and then gained momentum by virtue of the advent of neuroimaging with MRI and PET scanning technology, and then the emergence of molecular genetics, and then the burgeoning of neuroscience as a discipline, which took all the basic neuroscience approaches and focused them on the brain. Psychiatry was sort of catapulted forward. So here I was in medical school in the 1970s when all this really was converging and moving the field forward out of the kind of intellectual wasteland where it had been without really any real understanding, and beyond what had been the kind of domination of psychiatry by Freudian theory. And I'll come back to Freud in a minute. So in medical school, I was sort of there when this all began to happen. And in the course of my 3-decade then career, I was able to sort of see and participate in the evolution as it occurred. So it put me in a position to not just describe a history and not just to punctuate it with clinical case histories, but also to provide sort of an autobiographical perspective. And another thing that I thought was really, I guess, fitting was the fact that if one were to look over the 200-year trajectory of psychiatry, there has been, in its effort to try and achieve sort of an understanding of the basis of mental illness and development of treatments, there has been a kind of an oscillation between the biologic and the metaphysical or psychodynamic. So when psychiatry sort of emerged, treatment of mental illness began to be taken as a medical sort of mandate. The notion was simply providing a supportive, protective environment for people with mental illness. And this was a psychiatrist or a doctor named Philippe Pinel who really created asylums and unlocked the chains of people who were in mental institutions. But then in the 19th century, when psychiatry, when medicine overall was beginning a systematic investigation, the process really consisted mostly of anatomic pathology, cadavers, organs, looking for the pathologic bases for illness. Focus on this, but this was a fruitless effort. And then entered Freud. And Freud came about in the late 19th century when psychiatry had not been able to benefit by these scientific efforts, and he came up with this brilliant theory, this incredible tour de force. His invention of the psychoanalytic theory was the equivalent intellectually, scientifically speaking, of Einstein's theory of relativity, or Copernicus and Galileo's heliocentrism. He, by dint of his intellectual genius, was able to do this. And that moved psychiatry back into the psychodynamic metaphysical because there was no tangible basis for the illnesses. The problem is that this became something which Freud made 2 mistakes with. One was that he forbid scientific investigation to verify it, so it remained basically a theory that you had to accept on faith. And then his disciples, the neo-Freudians, began to extend it way beyond the scope for which it genuinely was valid and could apply, which was an understanding of how the human mind evolves over the life cycle and how it functions. And Freud introduced seminal concepts that still are valid today and have really been given sort of new life in the context of cognitive neuroscience. He introduced the concept of the consciousness and unconscious. Before that, everybody thought they knew everything that was in their mind and would govern their behavior. He introduced the idea of somebody evolving over stages of development. He a little overemphasized the sexual dimension of that, but it was still an evolution of stages across the life cycle. He introduced the concept of components of the mind, id, ego, superego. He described defense mechanisms as a way in which we somehow cope with our conflicts and emotional distressing feelings, rationalization, sublimation, denial, projection. So he was a genius, but he restricted any type of experimentation, any tampering with the method, and it became a faith, a dogma, that really constrained all of psychiatry up until the 1950s with the real beginning of a scientific revolution. So the scientific revolution, what I just told you, stemmed from psychopharmacology and then imaging and genetics and neuroscience, kind of shifted the pendulum back towards the emphasis on the biologic. There was a chairman of psychiatry at Yale in the 1970s named Morton Reiser, and he ruefully commented at the time, he says, for the last 50-some years, psychiatry has been brainless, and now we're moving towards a state where we're going to be mindless. So there's been this oscillation, and in terms of my own sort of evolution, the reason why I thought it was somehow fitting was because, being a good Jewish son, I guess I was always sort of feeling some pressure to become a doctor, but not necessarily a psychiatrist. But then when I went to college and I started reading my introductory psychology course, Freud, I was really struck by the power of his theory. He was, in addition to being a genius, he was also a brilliant communicator. He wrote extremely well, and when you read it, it becomes just enthralling. But at the same time, I also was going to school, I'm dating myself, the 1960s, which was a time of a lot of cultural unrest and experimentation and so forth and so on. So I did sort of have some dabbling in recreational drugs. And I guess this is like the one thing I might share in common with Stephen Jobs, certainly isn't his financial success, is that we both feel that LSD was a very important sort of experience to have. But in my case, I think it's a little different than in Stephen's case. In my case, the impact that it had on me, and this was after I had read Freud and I was really just completely fascinated by his theory, was how you could take a tiny amount of a pharmacologic substance, 50 micrograms or so, and it could so profoundly change your state of mind. And if this was the case, then by some slight error in an enzyme or a cofactor or the synthesis of a neurotransmitter, you could change the way a person's mental state was very powerfully. So this sort of exemplified this kind of dichotomy, which really is the essence of psychiatry and mental illness, which is on one hand clearly reductionistic, or reducible to neurobiology, but at the same time also reflects the ephemeral and the existential. So proceeded to write the book, and the book, which I hope you'll take a look at, because I write in a turgid academic prose, but my editor and the person who helped me with the writing, Ogi Yogas, sort of beat me up, and I think we've made it really an interesting and entertaining book that flows. And the book starts with a story, and all the stories in the book are about patients that I've seen, and they're all real, they're just anonymized. And it starts with a story about, I got visited by a very famous person. Obviously they're anonymized, and I won't even tell you the profession they were in, but it's a household name. And his wife came to see me about their daughter, who was 20 years old. She had been at an Ivy League school, and she was having difficulty, and they had to pull her out. And her difficulty was her grades slipped, her behavior was weird, and she really wasn't functioning in the typical way. And so they brought her to see me, but this was like 3 years after she had been dropped out of school. And in the interim, they had had her seen by a motivational coach and a self-esteem therapist, sent her to a wilderness camp, had her seen by various New Age people, and then one day they were scared by an incident that occurred. The daughter was supposed to meet her mother in Manhattan for lunch, and she didn't show up. And it turns out she had gotten on the subway to go meet her mother, but some sleazy guy kind of inveigled her in getting off the subway with him and going back to his apartment. So the mother was freaking out, and she tracked her down via her cell phone. She called the police, and they rescued her. And when she told their family doctor about this, the doctor says, well, for Christ's sake, why don't you just take her to see a real doctor finally? So they did. So they came, and we did a thorough evaluation, and I told them, your daughter is psychotic, and I think the likelihood is that she has schizophrenia. Something you don't want to give that news to anybody, but they certainly didn't want to hear. But in any event, they agreed to hospitalize her. She was hospitalized, she was treated, she got better, but they still couldn't accept it. They took her to the hospital, and after following in the aftercare treatment that we had arranged for her, they took her out of treatment. And she, of course, relapsed fairly soon. The good news is that ultimately, through another means, was treated, achieved remission again, and ultimately was able to resume her life, get married, and pursue her interest in art. But it shows you the degree to which people will not sort of acknowledge this. And I have numerous stories about this. One that I sort of refer to that's not in the book, but is relevant to contemporary times, is that you're probably familiar with this case that's going on in the news now with Robert Durst. So Robert Durst, pretty bizarre guy, the scion of a wealthy real estate family, and he allegedly killed at least 3 people, if not more. But he's been weird his whole life. He's 71. And then he agreed to be a subject of a biopic documentary. And not being aware of it, he was wearing a live mic when he went to the bathroom at the end of the last series, or the last episode, and he basically confessed talking to himself. Well, this is speculation, but I think that it's very likely he was mentally ill and probably suffered from a psychotic illness. And when he was talking, he was actually talking to voices. But he had gone 70 years without ever being treated for this or evaluated, probably in part because he was rich and considered eccentric. In this way, it's sort of like John DuPont, who was the character in Foxcatcher, who also had a similar pattern of bizarre behavior, undiagnosed schizophrenia, and ended up killing this Olympic athlete that he had sponsored. So the book opens with an explanation of how there still is this sort of massive denial, and it's like, well, again, referring to Stephen Jobs, Steve, who believed in a lot of holistic types of practices, delayed his conventional medical treatment in favor of a holistic fashion, and that not only didn't work, it may have also allowed for his illness to progress to a point that was uncurable. So these attitudes sort of still prevail and limit people in terms of seeking treatment. But the other thing that the book tries to do in order to be able to dispel the stigma and persuade people that there are effective treatments for people with mental illness, and that mental illness is a bona fide set of medical conditions, is it tries to sort of fess up about the problems that have occurred in the past and why there is such skepticism or suspicion or hostility towards psychiatry. It's true, psychiatry did some bad things. We know about the fact that first of all, institutions, mental institutions, asylums weren't necessarily the best places. But beyond that, there were treatments that were either ineffective or in some cases seeming, in retrospect, to have been barbaric. The first Nobel Prize that was ever given for a treatment for mental illness or for anything related to psychiatry was given to an Austrian psychiatrist for malaria therapy. So malaria therapy was injecting the blood of people who had malaria into mental patients. And the reason that that was done was that the doctor, and this was circa 1920, had observed that when patients in his asylum became febrile, that their symptoms seemed to improve. And he thought that fever must have some kind of therapeutic effect. So he thought to induce fever by injecting various types of infectious agents. So first he started with strep and then the tubercular bacilli. But then he tried malaria. Why malaria? Well, because antibiotics hadn't been developed yet. There was nothing for tuberculosis. But for malaria, there was quinine. So you can infect them with malaria and get the therapeutic benefit if it had that for their mental problems. But he could also control their somatic symptoms with quinine. And he got a Nobel Prize for that. Well, it turned out that he was right, but only partially, because what that did, the fever caused by the malaria, was to kill spirochetes in the brain of people who had tertiary syphilis, because mental institutions at the time, in addition to people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, had a lot of people that had syphilis that had progressed to enter the brain and produce the sort of tertiary stage and produce symptoms which look like psychosis. And the next Nobel Prize that was given for psychiatry was to the Portuguese neurologist Moniz for developing the prefrontal lobotomies. So this sounds pretty gruesome, and it is, in retrospect. But in defense of our profession and these people, at the time, and this is sort of like trying to avoid us being guilty of presenteeism, looking at the past through the lens of 2015, the alternative was the abysmal conditions of the asylum and a life of potentially continuing symptoms. So this shows you the desperation that people were going to. But then Freud, again, although he did have this brilliant theory, his disciples extended it and over-applied it in ways that added to the ignominy of the profession. And this brings us to the point where the neo-Freudians. So if anybody wants to know, what is psychoanalytic theory relevant to? It's relevant to you and me and everyone else that ostensibly is free of a mental illness. It is relevant to understanding sort of how our psychological makeup and our identity and personality developed. And psychoanalysis is useful for people for sort of self-exploration or for finding out how you can avoid certain conflicts that may occur in your life, whether it's you don't get along with your boss or you have no sort of gratifying romantic relationships or you're engaging in self-defeating behavior or so forth. But it's not going to do anything for somebody who has schizophrenia. It's not going to do anything for somebody who has bipolar disorder or depression or obsessive-compulsive disorder or panic disorder or an eating disorder or an addiction or autism or dementia. But the neo-Freudians tried to apply it to this. And as a result, who gets blamed? The mother. So Frieda von Reichmann, who was the psychiatrist in the well-known book, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, coined the term schizophrenic mother, because mothers who engage in some kind of confusing, contradictory, self-critical, or overly critical behavior can induce this. When autism was finally described in 1943, they coined the term refrigerator mother as the basis for autism. And then there was, of course, the other things such as penis envy and the Oedipal complex and all of these things. And so this sort of added to the suspicion and querulousness that people had about psychiatry. So you had illnesses that nothing could work, and then you had doctors that came up with these sort of fanciful theories and treatments that were either ineffective or harmful. And this created a legacy which gave rise to the bad reputation and the kind of notorious identity of the profession. But then, as I've said, in the 50s it began to change, first serendipitously, and then as a result of these developments in the life sciences and biomedical research. And the change has been extraordinary, to the point that now we have effective treatments for most things. Now, people say that psychiatry is still, kind of a indolent, ineffective profession. But that's just a bogus criticism. It's just not true. If you look at conditions in, let's say, neurology, our sibling discipline, two of the major diseases, three of the major diseases, they treat Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease. These are diseases that there's an extensive knowledge of the neurobiology. With Huntington's, we even have the gene that causes it. We've had it for over 2 decades. There's no treatment for it. There's no effective treatment. There's not been an innovation in the treatment of Parkinson's disease since L-DOPA. Now, why is that? So all this time that psychiatry was sort of making these missteps, and other fields, or at least neurology, was making progress, but limited progress with no treatments, it wasn't because they're slackers, or weren't trying, or weren't smarter. It wasn't the dumbest kids in the class were going into psychiatry. The brain turns out to be a much tougher organ to understand, and the illnesses that affect it much more complicated to develop treatments for. If you look at the brain compared to the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, there's no comparison. The brain's like a pump. The kidneys are a filter. Your stomach is a tube with porous holes for absorption. The brain has over 100 billion neurons, 30 trillion connections. Each part of the brain functions in a distinct way from other parts of the brain. It's unfathomably complex. And the human brain is the most highly evolved structure in the entire universe in terms of organisms. And the functions of the brain that psychiatry attends to for mental illness are the most highly evolved in the entire animal kingdom. So it's taken a long time to really begin to get traction on that. And a lot of it had to do with the availability of the adequate technology to do so. So I guess just to try and sum up, I would say, there are other things that psychiatry has done that have also sort of contributed to the ignominy that sort of mental illness and psychiatry faces. The unfortunate inclusion of homosexuality as a mental disorder was one. Another was the lack of inclusion of PTSD until after Vietnam, really, was another. But there's been a purposeful and a scientifically driven effort to correct these. And the point is that whatever may have gone before, which we can try and understand and determine sort of how problematic it is or was, that's not the reality now. But it's the attitudes and the prejudices that persist which cloud the public's understanding and deter people from seeking treatment. And so the thing that I want people to take away from this book, and I would like you to sort of understand, is that there's no reason that people who suffer from conditions should continue to. It's simply a matter of investing the time and money that it takes to at least have a consultation. There are treatments that are effective. And by treatments, I'm not just talking about medications. I'm talking about various types of psychotherapies or psychosocial treatments as well. But they're scientifically driven in terms of determining their efficacy and their safety. And the other thing is that, so for you, for your family, for your friends, you should not be inhibited by expressing that you have nothing to lose by at least exploring whether there may be a need for treatment. The other thing is that since so much of the way any healthcare service can be provided is influenced by public awareness and government policy, the media and the government need to be moved. Left to their own devices, they're not doing the right thing. The media misrepresents, sensationalizes, distorts, and the government's policies for biomedical research funding and for providing healthcare financing for mental health care services as opposed to medical or surgical services is really not consistent with what the needs of people with mental illness are and what the whole epidemiology is. Just to give you one last statistic, the World Bank does a study every several years measuring the global burden of disease, and they quantify this in the context of a metric called a Disability Associated Life Year, a DALY. And if you look at youth, 14 to 45, 4 of the top 10 conditions are mental disorders. It's predicted that by 2030, depression will be the most expensive condition in the world. So there's good reason for the government to pay attention to this public health issue. And I think since left to their own devices, they won't, to whatever degree people who have their sort of awareness raised or motivated can help to do that. And again, this goes back to why I wanted to write the book. When people say, when I tell people about it, I say, well, it was in a moment of maybe, it was sort of a quixotic moment, but we'll see if the book gets any attention and if it has any impact on the world. So if we have some time, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
You mentioned some parts of the body that are relatively easier to treat than the brain. So knee surgery is relatively straightforward, hip surgery, relatively straightforward. And the physicians who do those types of treatments maybe don't take the same kind of flack that psychiatrists do. I started to think about low back pain as something that's really common. Just like everybody has a mental illness, everybody gets low back pain at some point in their life. And often people will go to a holistic type of practice, or they'll go do various physical therapies, chiropractor. But the extreme example would be going to get back surgery, kind of like the extreme in psychology would be go see a psychiatrist. And I think part of the rep with back pain is they say back surgery, fusions, things like that are quite ineffective, maybe 30% chance of success. And they often can lead to problems down the line. Would you say that maybe part of the perception with psychiatry is you only hear about those cases where it doesn't work or when mistakes are made, you don't hear the success stories?
I think that's very true. First of all, people don't want to disclose, even if they've had a good experience. They're more inclined to lay blame. So Katharine Graham, the former publisher of the Washington Post, had a several decade-long grudge against psychiatry. Why? Because her husband, who had manic depressive illness, was treated with psychoanalysis, never given lithium, and committed suicide. That was a widely known case. But the success, such as the famous person I told you about, whose daughter was averted from a lifelong disability, they're not going to, they don't want, if I call them and ask them, would you talk at a benefit, or would you be a public spokesperson? No. Don't want to hear about that. And that gets to the kind of stigma thing. Many patients won't use their health insurance because they don't want to be on the record. Many patients, and this is particularly with the VIPs, they don't want to come see me or see our doctors in the hospital, in the clinic. They want to go to a private office on Park Avenue or Central Park West so they don't have to walk into something that's psychiatry. So this is a very common phenomenon. It's changing, and it's actually better in the United States than any part of the world. I mean, Asia, forget it. But it's still going very slowly.
I wanted to press a little bit on your assertion that it's all about stigma, that that's the principal barrier, because it seems like access is enormously challenging. I mean, if you look at the prevalence of mental illness amongst the homeless or amongst prison populations, it's way out of proportion with where it is in other aspects of the population. So how can you say that stigma is stronger, say, in the US than the access barriers and just availability of treatment?
Well, I completely agree with you. Whether it's lack of access or stigma, they're both major contributors to it. But the lack of access problem is that there's not sort of a sufficient providers and services to take care of everybody or to take care of everybody in an affordable way. And as a result, people that might be seeking treatment may not have an easy time finding it. If they pursue it, though, most people should be able to. The problem is, and this is a problem that contributes to the homeless as well as the increasing numbers of people with mental illness who are in the criminal justice, in the prison system, is that many people, and this is particularly for the psychotic disorders, mood disorders also, many people who have mental illnesses don't think they're sick, and they don't want treatment. And our society is built on personal autonomy, individual liberty, self-determination, and we're very reluctant to sort of impose something on somebody against their will, unless they're overtly dangerous. So there's many people who, even if they had ready access, wouldn't seek treatment, and their families can't find a way to persuade or even coerce them into treatment, and doctors can't impose it unilaterally. So, but you're absolutely right, and one of the other things that I think is really problematic with our health financing is led to a situation where doctors psychiatrists have the lowest percentage of accepting insurance as opposed to paying out of pocket. And that's because of the inequity of the reimbursements. Patrick Kennedy and Senator Edward Kennedy's Mental Health Parity Act has begun to sort of address that, but this has been passed as legislation and has not been enforced yet. So the insurance companies are still doing what they can get away with.
I guess piggybacking on the access, like you mentioned that it's been my experience that psychologists and psychiatrists have a much lower rate of accepting insurance. And you made the distinction between like psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors, that psychiatrists are primarily focused on defined illnesses, but I've been my experience that there are a lot of not just psychologists, but counselors or whatever that try to treat more severe mental illness, maybe not schizophrenia, but certainly depression or bipolar disorder. And that if, I came in with a twisted ankle and I sought treatment pretty quickly, I could figure out, you go to the doctor, and the first doctor I went to would probably be able to help me. That is certainly not the case as much with mental illness. So I guess my question is, what are your thoughts on how to
Right, well that's part of the confusion of, okay, let's say you think that you may have something that needs to be taken care of. Who do I see? Mm-hmm. Okay, and how do I know who to go to? And then there's the access and the cost issue. My rule of thumb is that psychiatrists don't need to do anything. You don't necessarily need to pay a psychiatrist to see you once or twice a week for 45 minutes to talk about your inability to form good romantic relationships or why you can't get along with authority figures. Mm-hmm. Good, competent therapists can do that. But if you want to go to a psychiatrist to make sure there's nothing more serious going on than just that, you can start with a psychiatrist. And what's evolving, and this is being driven by really economic pressure, what insurance benefits are willing to pay. What's evolving is that the psychiatrist will make use of physician extenders. Just like if you twist your ankle and you go to an orthopedist, they take an x-ray, maybe you broke it, they set a cast, but then they'll send you to a physical therapist. Mm-hmm. Psychiatrists can see you, say, okay, I don't think that you have personality disorder, or I don't think you have a mood disorder that requires treatment, but I think psychotherapy would be good. You can see me for it if he or she practices it, or I can ask you to see a social worker or a psychologist that would be perfectly capable of seeing you. There's going to be more of this kind of team-based approach and this sort of delegation of of various aspects of the treatment recommendations. The problem is this is all coming so slow. It's just not taken seriously. Part of it is our government is dysfunctional, and part of it is because this hasn't risen to a sufficient level of urgency. Let me just give you one example. It takes a lot to mobilize a government and a country. The one thing that did it, amazingly, was AIDS. AIDS was complete. When I was in training in the late 70s, we would see people coming in the emergency room with these horrible infections, opportunistic infections. There was no clear cause for it. There was no sort of etiologic agent. They had low blood counts and these roaring infections. But the gay community, the entertainment community, rose up and they lobbied out of the box for the government to jump on this. And they poured money. It was like a Manhattan Project for this condition. And within 6 years, they had identified the virus. So it went from AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, to HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. And then within another 6 years, they had protease inhibitors, antiretroviral therapies, and then the advent of triple therapy, which took a mysterious lethal disorder and made it into a chronic illness like hypertension or diabetes that could be managed. So mental illness doesn't have that kind of thing, okay? So for depression, for bipolar, for schizophrenia, for anxiety disorders, maybe you can't mobilize that kind of thing. But why haven't we done this with PTSD? If there's one thing that you think the country should rally around, particularly since now more people die by suicide in the military than by enemy combatants, and the frequency of PTSD injuries is more than by any type of somatic injury. It's shameful. So when I got into this APA leadership thing, I spent 2 years in Washington, and it's a very cynical business, the business of politics and government. It's tough to change. But this is really what it takes, and this is, again, alluding to my quixotic effort to write this book. It's a need to try and really raise awareness, speak out, try and mobilize, because these are tractable problems.
I'm trying to better understand. You made a distinction, I think, between psychosis and neurosis, although you didn't identify it as such. And you kind of say psychiatry is about psychosis.
No, not psychosis, mental illness. Psychosis and neurosis is a distinction that really harkens back to the earlier nomenclature in Freudian theory. I was equating neurosis in a sense with the kind of problems of living that occur, and mental illness as a defined set of conditions which includes psychosis, but isn't exclusively psychosis.
Then what distinguishes PTSD from other forms? PTSD is based on an experience, not a childhood experience, an adult experience, that shapes your interaction with the environment. How is this different than other experiences? And why do you find this as mental illness and other things are just for psychologists to take care of? This is confusing to me.
Well, forget about who takes care of them. I think anybody who can get them better should take care of them. But why is PTSD an illness? Well, somebody undergoes some kind of experience. It's usually a single traumatic event, but it can be a series of traumatic events, whether it's an earthquake, a fire, a mugging, a firefight in Afghanistan, or an IED explosion. And prior to that, they were ostensibly not ill, healthy. And subsequent to that, they begin to develop a variety of mental aberrations and behaviors. Anxiety, hypervigilance, sleeplessness, irritability, inability to concentrate. It sometimes leads them to do things like abuse alcohol or other medications to self-medicate, or get into violent altercations. And this doesn't just go away like, you bump your knee and after a few days the pain subsides. This persists. So here you have an environmental or experiential event which results in some enduring pattern of mental distress and behavioral dysfunction. So we call that an illness. As to who should treat it, I think right now our treatments are very limited in terms of what works. And the problem there is that sufficient attention, I mean, PTSD is not a new condition. You know, it's been around since the history of warfare. But we didn't take it seriously until after Vietnam. But there wasn't an all-out effort to try and understand what is the pathophysiology of this. How does an experience affect the brain so that you're thereafter different? If it turns out that the best way to treat somebody like that is through horseback riding or pet therapy or exercise or meditation or psychotherapy or aversion conditioning, fine. But if it turns out that it's medication, you know, that's fine too. You know, we just have to understand what it is that's needed. But I would consider it an illness beyond a shadow of a doubt.
I remember a couple of years ago, we had a lot of unfortunate incidents, tragedies in America with school shootings. And I remember the most poignant thing that came for me for that was a mother wrote an article or a story about how she had 3 children, 2 of which were healthy, normal, but one was very violent and I guess obviously mentally ill, and would have episodes that would go grab a knife maybe in the kitchen. No crime yet, but she knew and felt something was coming. And law enforcement says to her, he hasn't done anything yet. We can't do anything for you. You can just sort of send him to the institution and see what happens. Often, I think parents take the blame. How could you not know your kid was going to do this? And she knows, but didn't have an outlet or an option. And it's tragic. Do you have any hope for America, for the world, for how that can get better?
Well, so that was I Am Adam Lanza's mother.
Exactly.
Yeah, this was after the Newtown tragedy when Adam Lanza killed these kids. Then this mother, I think, was in Idaho.
That's right.
Wrote this article. So it really relates to how do you deal with a situation where there's a family member or friend, whatever, who's sick, potentially violent, doesn't want treatment, and you can't force them to receive treatment. And the majority of these civilian massacres that have occurred, whether it's, you know, when Congressman Gabby Giffords was shot, whether it was Aurora, Colorado, whether it was the Virginia Tech shooting, whether it was the Santa Barbara killing, these are not entirely, sometimes you have ideological zealots, but these are predominantly individuals with mental illness who are untreated. So Robert Durst is, I'm suggesting he may be like that, although he didn't do a civilian massacre. He just killed 1 people individually over a period of time. I was doing a reading at a bookstore last night, and afterwards, when I was signing books, a woman came up to me and told me she was Iranian, lives in San Francisco, and says, "I wonder if you could help me." I said, "What's the problem?" He says, "I have a brother who has schizophrenia, he's in Iran, and he killed my mother, and he's now in prison. Is there something I can do?" So you see this intra-family violence all the time. These people don't know what they're doing, but there's no means to treat them. When I was at the University of North Carolina, there was a law student who in his first year became psychotic, had a first episode of schizophrenia. And we hospitalized him, he was treated, he got better. The symptom remission was very high, particularly at the beginning of the illness. He went home for the summer, stopped his medication, came back to school. Unfortunately, we didn't, the law school and we didn't sort of identify him and require him to resume treatment. Not that we could have posted on it if he didn't want it anyway. And 3 months later, he walks down the main street of Chapel Hill and he kills 2 people, 2 complete strangers, because he was hallucinating about what they were thinking and saying about him. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity, remanded to a state mental hospital, and I interviewed him. And because he had wanted to write a book about this experience. His name is Wendell Williamson. And he was completely lucid, had complete insight into what was happening. Said, I had no idea what, I mean, the internal reality of my delusions and hallucinations were as vivid as everything that's in this room around us. But this is something that goes beyond science, goes beyond the medicine. This is a social policy issue. And if I say this in a large audience, people are, I get a lot of angry comments and sometimes even hate mail. If you suggest the idea of imposing treatment on people when they don't want it, there's a strong reaction to that. And it's because in the past, treatments were imposed on people either unjustifiably or the treatments were ineffective. But this is the dilemma. But I advocate what I'll call sort of maternalistic or paternalistic medicine, that if people are making judgments that if you're a Christian Scientist and you don't want treatment for your cancer, your heart disease, you want to die, that's fine. But mental illness is a little different. It's like if you have tuberculosis and you don't want to get treated and you're a contagion, or AIDS. So there's some social ramifications to giving people, to emphasize, elevating the rights of the individual over the welfare of society. And that's above my pay grade.
Thank you for the answer, and I think we're at time, but there's books in the back. Thank you, Dr. Lieberman.